In the late 17th century, the Mughal Empire commanded roughly a quarter of the world's wealth. Under Emperor Aurangzeb, it governed millions of people across the Indian subcontinent through a massive, highly centralized administration. Fast forward just a few decades, and the capital of Delhi is in ruins. Invaders are actively looting the imperial treasury, and the emperors themselves have been reduced to blinded, powerless puppets. Meanwhile, taking advantage of the sudden chaos, a relatively small British trading corporation is quietly carving up the subcontinent for itself. The standard historical explanation for this rapid collapse is simple. Aurangzeb's successors were weak. The narrative claims they were lazy, incompetent, and too busy drinking to effectively rule. The math tells a different story. The Mughal state fell because a structural flaw in its economic algorithm caused it to completely hollow itself out from the inside. To understand how an empire goes bankrupt, we have to look at its engine, a structure known as the Mansabdari system. The emperor sat at the top, handing out parcels of land, called jagirs, to a class of elite nobles. These nobles, or mansabdars, collected tax revenue from their assigned lands. In exchange, they used that money to maintain specific quotas of cavalry and troops, ready to fight for the emperor at a moment's notice. For decades, this created a balanced administrative loop. But the math of this arrangement required constant growth. To reward new nobles and maintain military superiority, the empire had to continually conquer fresh, highly profitable territory. By the late 1600s, that expansion hit a wall. The empire ran out of lucrative land to conquer in the south. Yet the emperor continued to recruit more and more nobles to manage the massive state. Suddenly, there were too many elites and not enough land to pay them. This triggered a severe systemic gridlock. A bloated, highly ambitious ruling class began fighting bitterly over a finite and quickly shrinking pool of agricultural revenue. When an elite class grows larger than the actual economic base can sustain, the resulting financial pressure always flows in one direction, downward, onto the poorest citizens. Desperate to maintain their lavish lifestyles and meet their military quotas, the nobles squeezed the peasantry. They drastically hiked up tax rates on farmers who were already living on the margins. The breaking point arrived quickly. Faced with total starvation and impossible tax demands, thousands of peasants simply dropped their plows and fled their fields entirely. That sheer economic desperation turned agricultural regions into powder kegs. Widespread armed revolts erupted across the countryside, led by localized groups like the Jats, Sikhs, and Marathathas. Because the fields were abandoned and the provinces were in open rebellion, the flow of tax revenue up the chain completely stalled. The imperial treasury in Delhi began to run dry. Seeing an empty treasury and a powerless emperor, ambitious provincial governors made a calculated choice. They stopped sending their tribute to the capital altogether, keeping the revenue for themselves. The empire fractured precisely along the fault lines created by its own broken tax collection machine. Looking at this map of the region from 1785, you can see the new geopolitical reality. The previously unified territory dissolved into a patchwork of autonomous, self-governing regional states like Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad. The emperor technically still sat on the throne in Delhi, but in reality he was living as a pensioner, entirely reliant on the charity and protection of these new regional warlords. This deeply fractured landscape is the true context for the British colonization of the subcontinent. The British East India Company simply stepped into the massive power vacuum left by the Mughals, systematically absorbing the disconnected regional states one by one. The wealthiest empire on the globe committed a slow suicide, taking decades to bleed out from its own administrative failures. Superpowers rarely fall entirely to foreign swords. By the time the invaders arrive, the empire has almost always defeated itself, collapsing under the weight of an economic structure that failed to adapt.